Hello and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly show where I read through the letters to the editor in my local paper, The West Australian, and criticise the stupid people who write in things. So, first letter. Drawing a wrong conclusion, 7 May 2014. Monday's front page says there are 2,400 speed fines a day. If it's as common as that, we might as well make speeding legal. Crazy? Of course! But it's a common argument for legalising drugs. Gavin O'Connor, Wembley. Well, the thing that you've missed, Gavin, is that the argument for legalising drugs isn't purely based on how common it is. The main foundation of it is that essentially drug use is seen as a victimless crime, or a consensual crime, as it's often called. That is, if adults choose to use various substances on their own body, broadly speaking, it's hard to see what the argument against that is. The best that people come up with is that it does some harm to society due to the possible effects of it. But the actual criminalising of the drug use doesn't make a whole lot of sense. An analogy is pretty useful here. Should we criminalise people eating too much? Because obviously people who are obese have higher health burden on society. So should we criminalise that? Of course not. Well, by the same token, if people choose to smoke, we say that's fine to be legal, but if people choose to smoke marijuana, we say no, that's illegal. Why? Don't know. Mainly it's the historical argument. So, part of the argument for legalisation also comes from the fact that it is now a very common thing. So not only is it basically not a particular drain on the economy, the actual drug use itself, but it costs a lot to do all sorts of law enforcement type stuff on it, and the harm that comes with it being illegal, while many people are doing it. There's an old saying in concept from, I think it was the Roman Empire, which was that if laws are routinely ignored, that actually is a sign of a bad law, and that law should be discarded, that essentially the people have voted by ignoring that law. And on another tangent, speeding is not legal, but it is not criminal either. Small to moderate amounts of speeding, the kind that people routinely do, is not criminal. It's not a criminal offence in our society. It is just a civil offence, which is why you pay a fine rather than going to jail for it. And so on that basis, I think would you agree that we should decriminalise marijuana, make it a civil penalty rather than or make it a fine rather than a jail sentence? Drawing conclusions, 8th of May 2014. I think most people would see the humour in James Packer having a bit of a biffo with David Gingle. Of course, had it been a couple of teenagers, we would think they're bogans. M. Sims, Balladura. Yeah, so anybody who missed it, a couple of very wealthy, James Packer's a millionaire, David Gingle is head of, I think it's Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 9, and they had a punch up in the street. And you're right, if it had been teenagers, we would have just thought of them as bogans. If they were Aboriginal teenagers, people would have been terrified and been called for these people to be locked up and taken off our streets, which goes some way to showing how prejudiced we are as a society. It also explains why we sometimes get upset at the soft punishments that are given out to young offenders. When young people have fights on the street, we are terrified. When, millionaires do, we think nothing of it and laugh and think, well, they shouldn't be punished, which is the double standard we have. Tit for tat, 9th of May 2014. The report, Asylum Seekers Put in One Boat, 7th of the 5th, implies that while the Indonesian government is not overly concerned about asylum seekers leaving Indonesia in rickety boats to head to Australia, it is concerned about those same people being sent back to Indonesia in the same rickety boats. M.E. Andržić, 2J. Well, yes, broadly speaking, the Indonesian government is much more concerned about the Australian government sending back refugees in rickety boats, rather than asylum seekers leaving Indonesia. To see why this is the case, first of all, in the rare occasion that asylum seekers have arrived at Australia and have decided that they'd rather head on to New Zealand, the Australian government is not particularly interested in preventing them. Very few governments are. Generally speaking, if a bunch of asylum seekers want to move on to another country, most governments are fairly happy to see the back of them. And so it's hardly surprising that Indonesia, which is a relatively poor country, especially compared to Australia, is fairly happy to see a small trickle of refugees leaving south of its border to Australia. And I say small trickle because if you look at the actual numbers of refugees in Indonesia, it's much higher than the small numbers that come to Australia. So yeah, they're fairly happy to see the back of them. They're probably not massively happy that they're going in rickety boats, but basically it's not seen as being much of their problem. Now, when a wealthy nation like ours takes the steps to put these people back into other rickety boats to send them back, in essence, we are culpable for some of the results. To see why this is so, it's a well-known result in most of ethics that people judge the results of your actions judge your actions more harshly if they have the same results of not taking action. This comes particularly from the trolley car thought experiment. So the idea here is that if you have a small train going downhill on a track, and there's some people on the track beneath it, that if you do nothing, there's going to plough into them and kill them. You have a rather large fat person next to you that you can push in front of that car, and if you push it in front of it, push the person in front of it, and that person dies, you'll save all the rest of them. Now, most people will generally argue that you shouldn't take action, that people dying as a result of your inaction is better somehow, not good, but better than people dying as a result, one person dying as a result of your action. This is the same argument we make in terms of not harvesting organs from people who are still living. And it's a general sort of reasonable ethical stance to take, that when you take action, you are more culpable for the results than the results that would happen if you refrain from taking action. And so, the rickety boats, so when the Indonesian government essentially allows or doesn't take big steps to stop asylum seekers from leaving their country in rickety boats, most people would actually agree that they are less culpable for those people, for the death or the suffering of those people, than the Australian government actively putting people into boats to send them back to Indonesia. And that explains why your simplistic little argument doesn't actually hold much water, Mr. Andricic. Next, paying for children. 9th of May 2014. Taxpayers pay for essential services, not to prop up those who think we owe them. If you want 5 kids that you can't afford, your problem. Gwen Moppet, Doubleview. Here's the thing. We don't pay people for the kids that they can't afford because they think we owe them. What we do is we pay for the raising of children in our society. We generally agree that children in our society are the innocent victims of their circumstances. And yes, parents who have too many children or can't afford to feed their children through whatever circumstances, even if it is their own foolishness, we generally as a society agree that we don't take that out on their children. We don't say, well, bad luck, you had 5 children, you shouldn't have had that many, therefore we're going to leave those children to the suffering at your hands. And so yes, we do pay. It's hard to think of a good way of helping the children that doesn't at the same time help the parent that you don't want to encourage to have more kids. And so generally speaking, we kind of just get over the fact that there's no perfect way of dealing with that and just accept that we're going to have to probably pay money to the parents to look after the children if we don't take the children off them. And this is considered basically an essential service of society, to provide a safety net for those who most need it. And the people who most need it here are the children. And if you don't like that, it just seems to me that that is incredibly cold-hearted. Killing a good thing. 12th of May 2014. When women are offered a seat in the train, I wish they would accept graciously. Responses I have heard, such as, nah, I'm right, are rude and foolish. And the man making the offer is less likely to do so again. Thoughtful acts are scarce and will eventually disappear. If chivalry is dying, don't put another nail in the coffin. Margaret Taylor Atwell. Well, here's the thing. If you don't want the seat that's being offered, I don't see why you should have to accept it. I hardly think saying no thank you or no I'm right is rude, and I hardly see it as foolish. The idea that thoughtful acts are scarce and are going to disappear, well, a truly thoughtful act is one that takes into consideration the wishes of the person who you're doing it for. And if you're commonly seeing people refusing offers of seats, then at some level that means that these people don't actually want the seat, and therefore the person who's making the offer doesn't truly understand the people that they're making the offer to. That is, it's not particularly thoughtful. It doesn't take into account the wishes of the people they're making offered. And the less of that happens, the better that is. Because if people don't want to be offered a seat, people don't want chivalry. If women don't want to be on the receiving end of chivalry, then I'm glad it's dying. And it doesn't mean that all thoughtful acts are going to disappear. It just means that we're going to have to find more appropriate ways of being thoughtful to each other, not based simply on our gender. I would never offer my seat just to a woman just because she's a woman. I mean, that's appallingly sexist, the idea that somehow women can't stand for as long as men because they're women and they're weak and they're soft. I would certainly offer my seat to people who are old and infirm, to people who are pregnant, to people who have kids, of either gender. Most pregnant people tend to be women. And I think that's thoughtful. They're simply offering it to women as a matter of course, to me, seems to be a rather old-fashioned and sexist take on women. The term to look up, if you're interested, is benevolent sexism. Lastly, cycling, not the answer. 13th of May, 2014. Paul Christensen says we should cycle to work to avoid the pain of price rises for parking and commuting. Pedal to Profitability, letters 9th of the 5th. This is okay for some people, but not all. He will next suggest that we save further costs by returning to caves, cooking by open fire and dispensing with showers. We pay taxes for public services to be provided by government, not for politicians' wealthy lifestyles and high-priced media staff. Drew Morton, Ellenbrook. Yes, so Paul Christensen, his suggestion that cycling would help people to avoid the increased cost of commuting and parking was not the suggestion that everybody should cycle, and obviously it's inappropriate for a great number of people. I think the point he made was actually a good one, which was that people generally don't consider cycling as an option and that they should be reminded of it. Increasing the cost of public transport is not a great thing in my mind, but broadly speaking is not a huge driver of pushing people away from public transport. People use public transport for a number of reasons, and small increases in cost don't generally drive people away, especially when you compare it to the cost of, say, parking in the city, which is where most commuters are going to, which is easily in the orders of $20 a day or so. And to suggest that he was actually advocating some return to living in caves and things is just stupid. Just because he's suggesting that cycling might be the way to go for some people. And yes, we pay taxes for public services to be provided, and yes, they are provided, and yes, there is costs going up, etc., etc. But if you look at the sheer numbers that are spent on things like politicians' salaries and staffing, you'll find that it is a small drop in the ocean in terms of the budget. This is one of those arguments that get bandied around all the time. Yes, I think the wages politicians are paid is something that really should be discussed. It's something we should have a debate over about whether this is appropriate to be paying these people that. But broadly speaking, one, it's not a large component of government expenditure. This is why it's never a big deal. This is why, even though there's a pay freeze for politicians at a federal level coming in this budget, it's not going to make any difference to the bottom line. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of dollars spent on politicians' salaries, which is a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the hundreds of billions which the budget is. And so cutting back on politicians' entitlements is not a way to save a budget that's in trouble. It is a way to do cheap politicking, and it is certainly a way to try and sort of stave off criticism. And there is some useful symbolism in it, but that's all it is. That's all the best it could hope to be is useful symbolism. And never forget, as much as we demonise politicians, from what I can tell from listening to Parliament and from being very interested in politics, is the vast majority of politicians, maybe not those who are the most visible or at the top, but the vast majority of politicians get into politics for very noble reasons. Almost all of them believe strongly in what they're trying to achieve there. They believe strongly in the platforms that they're espousing, and they are honestly trying to make the country better. I wholeheartedly disagree with huge numbers of them on a whole range of topics, but don't doubt that these people are there for the right reason. And a significant number of them could earn a lot more money in the private sector. And so a significant number of politicians take a pay cut to be in Parliament. And so the idea that sort of that we are somehow sort of supporting this ruling class like that is doesn't really follow from the evidence. And so I think we should always be careful about making those arguments. I think the time to be having a sober and rational discussion about politicians' entitlements is outside of the normal budget process, and is at a time when perhaps there isn't a huge amount of antipathy towards politicians, so that we can look at it with some sense of some clear-headedness. Anyway, that's my rant for this week. I feel better already. And I'll see you all next week to when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.